Thank you for agreeing to do this. We're going to go through a few details on this website. I'm quite
Pleasure.
glad it's a relatively simple website. There's lots of interesting details here, but otherwise it's too easy to get lost in all of the details.
Yeah,
Because I found even one detail you can dive into the sort of decisions behind it, and it takes even 10 minutes to discuss one simple thing.
certainly. I
So
might have to
carry on.
point out that this is like highly preliminary. This is a company that I launched maybe last month. And this is like version 2, I think, of the website. And I expect that throughout the lifetime of this company, there will be version 20, 30, 40. So this website will be highly, highly developed. There will be like a blog journal section in the future. There will be visuals of the work that we do. There will be, Q&A and different other sections, perhaps even if there are other lines of business that we go into, such as themes or templates for different website builders, which is on the agenda. Those will go in. So this is kind of like the first version of the thing, highly minimal. And I try to make it as minimal as possible and just keep the scope really small, but try to refine it as much as possible. That was the kind of drive behind it.
Yeah, well, even in this minimal first version, I think there's a lot of interesting details to dig into. So I'm gonna try to go top left to bottom right, and I'm probably going to start with structure.
Okay.
Because the first thing that jumps out to me is the visible structure behind everything, and I always love that in websites, so I have to dive into it here. The
Yeah.
first question I have is, why did you choose to make it as faint as it is rather than more visible?
Because I don't like making other elements too bright. So my text, for example, if you go with your contrast checker, which I'm sure you have somewhere on your computer, I use an app called Contrast, which is very useful for these things. So the most of the text is it sits at a AA rating. So it's kind of gray, it's kind of dim. So if I make the background structure more visible, the text becomes a little less readable. It kind of interferes with that. So I want it to be super, super as dim as possible. I think, and I can actually go in the code and check. I think this is the lowest gray, like the faintest gray, the lightest gray that there was in Tailwind, because I'm using
Right.
Tailwind CSS to build this thing. I believe it is set at gray 50 or maybe gray 100, which is extremely dim. Yeah, it's gray 100, so it's the second dimmest, lightest gray.
Yeah.
I just want it to be as light as possible, because otherwise it interferes with the other things, and I don't want to make the other things brighter. That's the summary of it, I guess.
No, that's great. Okay, so I don't even know whether it's worth asking about this from my perspective, but maybe someone will be curious. For each of these gutters, you've got 3, let's call them sections per gutter, in the central gutters, and then on these outsides, I'm assuming that's because they're margins, but you've only got 2. I was curious about that choice.
Yeah, well, obviously the middle ones kind of go between 2 elements, which is why. So the thinking behind the gutters is that I think they're 16 pixels each, the width of those, and it's a grid with 16 pixel gaps. Basically, that's what it is, and then the internal modules of the grid, the internal elements, if you look at the paragraphs and like the card kind of thing, also inside of them have a 16 pixel padding. So that actually represents the internal padding of the grid modules. It's not a structural part of the grid, it's a part of each module. And because there are no modules on the outside, you kind of perceive it as two kind of gaps. But in fact, if there was another module on the outside, there would be a third gap. Does that make it clear?
It does, yeah. I can see what you're describing. It's hard to use words. I don't know if we have words for like sub gutters, but yes, it makes sense. Speaking of the gutters, I can see over here. I'm going to get onto the actual components or the actual sort of foreground elements in a second.
Yeah.
But I can see over here you've got this sort of gray container, and then it's near these darker gray containers for the links. you've got a one sub gutter gap between them, which you said 16 pixels. If I come over here to this grid of darker gray containers, in between these, you've got a much smaller gap.
Yeah.
So could you explain that to me?
So basic Gestalt principles, things that belong together should sit closer together, and things that don't belong together, so different groups of things that are distinct from each other should have more space between them. And that whole grid of gray boxes is a group of things that belongs together. Hence, the spacing between them I just made smaller. It is actually related kind of mathematically to the larger gutter size. The gutter size is 16, and I believe that space should be 4 pixels. Gap 1 and gap 4 in Tailwind CSS. And it's also the same size that separates these little buttons or modules horizontally. So it's equal to the horizontal thing, which also reinforces the sense that this is a group of things that all belongs together. That's because if I increase that space, it kind of feels like there are 3 sections of things. It doesn't make it obvious that the middle column and the right column are actually part of the same group of things. It almost feels like it's kind of like these are like tiny details that when you look at these things, it adds maybe like 1% more of cognitive load for you to make sense of this whole structure and what's happening on the interface. So as much as possible, by doing that little trick, you make the user or the viewer do maybe 1% less work in their brain. And those little 1%s kind of add up over the user experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm curious, I assume was there a moment's hesitation during the design process where you thought sort of ideally this would be 16 pixels between these two sections, or did you not even consider it?
There was a lot of experimentation during the design process. Certainly the first time I designed it, I think it was sitting at 16, and I looked at it and I was like, this just is gonna look better if I experiment with it a bit. And then this was the result of trying out all of the possibilities.
It's a good example of setting up what looks like a relatively strict sort of rigid system, and then you find plenty of excuses or reasons to ignore the system for good reason, right? So, I think it's tempting when you set up a system like this to stick to it no matter what, but actually that sometimes results, as you're saying, in worse design if it's hard to tell these are related because they're too far apart.
Exactly. I mean, one of the philosophical kind of ideas behind this whole website is that I wanted to make it as minimal as possible, really. I mean, you can see that there's basically nothing on this website other than just some writing. But at the same time, I really wanted to communicate that, you know, this is a designer's website. We are highly sophisticated designers. That's kind of the value proposition of this website. This is the website of a very kind of a high level design director, a full stack design director, as I position myself and my company. But I'm not an artist, you know, I'm not an illustrator, I'm not that kind of designer. However, I'm very much an engineer at the same time. In fact, I am actually an engineer. I've studied mechanical engineering, and you know, I'm well versed in programming and computer science, and I do even code websites for my clients from scratch. And I have coded this website. In fact, I have designed this whole website in code. So there's no Figma file where the design for this sits. It's actually just designed. I kind of use code, or especially using Tailwind CSS and Next.js, and you know, a very good kind of dev tool set up on Visual Studio Code. I'm able to actually use the code as a design material and experiment with the design in code. But before I got to this stage, of course, I did plenty of experimentation, plenty of studies, etudes on grid systems. I at one point took the famous Grid Systems book by Josef Müller-Brockmann. In fact, here, this guy. So this is like, you know, every designer has this somewhere in their studio or in their home. And in this book, there are these examples towards the end of it. There's many examples of posters, book designs. Of course, there are no UI designs because this book is, I think, is from the 80s or something, before we had UIs. But at some point, a couple of years ago, I really wanted to go deep in this and become like a real expert. So what I did was I took this book, I put it in front of me, and I started replicating everything in this book. at least the kind of examples section in the end, in Figma. So I kind of rebuilt all of that, and I wanted to actually release it on the Figma community, but then I got lazy, so I didn't release it. But I have done that practice, and this was kind of a way of communicating all of that knowledge in a very, very simple thing. So in as much simplicity, communicate as much design expertise as possible. Maybe that's the short way of saying the philosophy behind this.
And do you think, because the website's got a relatively technical sort of blueprinty feel, do you think designing in code was responsible for that design direction?
I don't think so. It was more actually, that wasn't intentional, I would say. Designing in code is not, I think, responsible for that, because I design pretty much everything in code. Like if you look at the other websites that are linked on this page, so the design discipline website, which is my kind of YouTube channel and podcast and blog. If you look at Design Navigator, which is a part of that, it's a little web application that I made for designers to access, kind of personalized collections of resources and so on. Maple is a recent client that I started working with. So right now their website is very minimal, but it will expand. All of those were pretty much mostly designed in code, but not all of them have this feel, like especially if you go to Design Navigator, or maybe like the first page of it, but some of the interior pages definitely don't have the blueprinty feel. So that was, I think it was kind of by accident. It wasn't exactly the intention, but also at the same time, I did want to try to kind of reveal the underlying structure of it. I wanted to, in a way, bring the viewer into the design process. Like, this is how a designer thinks, or this is how I think as a designer. Using grid systems and using this kind of underlying structure. And again, it's also part of how I work with this company. When I have clients at Rectangle, one of the things that I like to do is, as much as possible, I bring them into the process and we co-design a lot of things. Even though this is a subscription design agency, which is a very popular business model these days, and a lot of people do subscription design agencies in a way that's very low touch. It's very, hands off, and they just receive requests in text and just submit a file and just go back and forth like that. I don't do it like that. I actually have calls with my clients. I actually personally know both of my clients that I'm serving right now, and I'm not expecting anyone to like sign up for this and use this as a service without any face-to-face, like at least like Zoom spoken contact. And I bring people in the process and I teach them about design. That's one of the value propositions here. So the grid system being visible is part of that, in a way, just as a vibe,
Yeah, I suppose in that sense, it makes more sense to have a grid system be visible on a designer's or an agency's website than on a product website.
Yeah,
which is where I usually see it, just because it doesn't necessarily relate to the product that a company might be selling, even though it does sort of look cool. So yeah, I can see the reasoning there. To get into some sort of probably minor details, I'm curious, because it's a relatively grayscale website, the only sort of splash of color, if it is color, it's hard actually to tell, is the background of this container on the left. It feels like a gradient that goes from gray to almost a yellow to a gray again. I'm not sure.
It is
this color?
It is a very faint yellow radial gradient with the blend mode set to soft light and the opacity set to like God knows what. So it's a very, very faint yellow gradient, a radial gradient. I like using radial gradients because they approximate kind of the way that real light behaves on objects. There are very, very few like linear gradients in nature. When you look at how, because light is usually a point source, which implies a radial, diffusion from the source. It's very rare that we actually have linear or surface light sources.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It is a tiny splash of color. It was a little random, I was experimenting with different things, just did like 5 or 6 variations on, just coding in different colors, and I ended up picking this one. It also kind of works, at least I felt that it worked, because the grays are slightly blue tinted, and the yellow is a contrast color to blue.
Yeah.
If I am not wrong, and I might be wrong, because I'm not really, like, color is kind of my weak spot as a designer. I'm trying to improve on it. I recently got a book about it. Let me show you. It's a very cool book. Color Clash. So it's
Oh, okay.
brand identity
Is that
designs.
Counterprint?
Yes, it's Counterprints.
Yeah. Okay.
I love their books. It's like a lot of brand identity designs and graphic designs with like extreme colors. And I'm reading Interaction of Color, which
Oh,
is
Joseph Alberts. Yeah.
yeah. I ordered it actually. I started reading a digital version and I ordered the physical one, but it hasn't arrived yet. So this is an area where I'm not as kind of as much of an expert as, like, let's say, grid systems or the technical implementation of these things. But I felt like yellow as a counter color to the blue tint of the gray is it just works nicely. I felt.
Yeah, and for such a subtle color scheme of sort of a grayscale color scheme, even having the subtlest color touch here, where you can't even necessarily tell it's a color, it just gives you the sense of a color almost.
Yeah,
it still has a big impact compared to the rest of the website. So that's I find that fascinating.
Yeah, it's also not unnatural. Like, there's a lot of websites these days. It's kind of like Web3 kind of look, where it's a lot of purple, pink, neon colors, like bright blues, things like that. But yellow is actually a color that you see frequently in nature, like the color of light. The color of just like the sun, the sunlight out there. So it just makes sense. Although this particular yellow is a bit more bright, it's like kind of a slightly unnatural yellow. It's like pure yellow, like it's RGB 255, 255.0 or something like that, which is less common in nature. But it's not meant to be natural. It's meant to be a little techie. So I liked it.
Nice. This is not necessarily a question, but I noticed you've got what I think of as the Twitter thread organization of text of different lengths here, because people who try to get engagement on Twitter always tend to make lists like this and then order them by size.
Oh, really?
It's just visually so satisfying, So as soon as I saw that, that's what made me think of it.
Yeah,
in case you wanted some feedback. But no, it's nice because it creates this real sort of hierarchical, or this nice gradient of size, on this
I'm like slightly obsessed with the text. I think like web typography and write. I love reading. I love books. I love paper and text and letters. And I also teach design. And one of the first things and like the most sort of highly repeated things that I teach is to be in control of your line width, to be in control of how much text you have. Never have, let's say, more than 4 or 5 lines in web copywriting. If you look at the paragraphs here, they are always like 4 lines, for example. On this particular screen size, they never go above that. So I kind of refine my text in order to fit that particular format. Then the line width, I'm always in control of that. So I always have like less than 10 words per line or something like that. And the next level of that kind of obsession, I guess, is to order things by length when you have a list and things like that. In fact, if you look at this like the way that it looks on your screen right now, which I guess is kind of like the maximum width view, everything is ordered by line width, line width, almost, like at least the controllable elements. If you look at rectangle, design director as a subscription service, that's also ordered by line width. The paragraph that is below the list is also reverse ordered by line width. So that's kind of that's a thing that I'm actually in control of as much as possible when I'm designing these things.
I think that's something that some sort of earlier visual designers don't necessarily consider. Early in their career, is that changing copy is sort of an advanced way to affect the visual design. It's not always possible just because sometimes we're not in control of the copy. But I do like that as sort of a hidden approach to take it to the 1% more than it was before,
Yeah, but you can still sometimes, you might not be in control of the copy, but you might be in control of how you break up the paragraphs or, how you break up the lines and things like that. So that's a little trick that designers could use.
Yeah.
It's the mark of a really, if it's the mark of a designer who knows what they're doing. I think when you being in control of the width of your text, especially, I see so many, because I teach design and I look at a lot of junior designers' work, and one of the things that immediately stands out in the work of a junior designer is that they have very long lines or very long paragraphs. That is just something that is very easily fixable and improves the look of everything immediately.
The next thing that jumps out of me is quite small, which is in these darker gray boxes that link to your examples.
Yeah.
You've got these numbered,
Yeah.
which I assume is a numbering of the projects or when they happen sort of chronologically.
Yeah.
But I noticed the number is in line with the second row of text.
Yeah.
And not the first one, which might be what people expect to have the number relate to the title. So I'm curious about why you decided to put it in the second row.
Well, the text is the same size as the second row text, and it is not the same size. So it just looks tidier if you do it this way. And generally, I like leaving that space in the upper left corner of the box is kind of a trick that you see a lot in these, like, for example, in the work of Josef Müller-Brockmann, the Swiss designer. Wait. This is one of my favorite books again. My workspace is deliberately arranged in this way because, again, I teach design and I pull out like maybe 10 books every time I have a lecture, and I teach online a lot. So this just like everything is here accessible easily. This is one of my favorite design books, The Graphic Artist and His Design Problems. And if you look, so this is just like a lot of examples from the work of Josef Müller-Brockmann. In so many places, he just leaves that space on that corner. Like this work for CWS, for example, some of his designs from, I think it's the 60s or 70s, or I don't know when it is from, but it's just old graphic design work, like canonical Swiss design work. He is the author of the Grid Systems book. The guy, literally the guy who wrote the book on grid systems, and the way he uses the grids is he like leaves that space on that first corner. I think it aids reading. It kind of, I feel like the reason that is done, and I don't like, I've never spoken to the guy obviously because he's passed away a long time ago, but I can speculate that the reason that space is done is that when you put something in there, the eye is immediately drawn to that top left corner, and then you skip over everything else. So you don't see anything else. You only see that thing in the corner. Whereas if you leave that corner empty, then you're kind of nudging or motivating the eye to actually look at everything else that is in the box, to acquire kind of like this holistic view of the box. Because the tendency, the habit of the eye is to look on the, you have this F-shaped like eye tracking heat maps that we know in web design that are supposed to be the way that people, so it's kind of like interrupting that F shape. Like there's nothing there. Like the usual place where the eye would concentrate in any box, you leave it empty. So the eye goes wandering and looking, and then it takes in actually more information. You take in all of the information that is in the other places in the box. So if you divide your box into 4, which here is not symmetrically done, so it's a very asymmetrical kind of division, 4 into 4. You leave that first quadrant empty, then the chance that people are going to read the rest of the things in that box increases. I don't know if this is scientifically true, but based on all the other things that I know, this is my kind of semi-informed speculation about why it works and why I kind of enjoy it.
Yeah. It makes me think of, I remember hearing a case study about traffic shaping where they try different things to help slow down traffic or make it safer. And in one place in England, they took this roundabout, essentially this big junction where there was lots of cars and pedestrians, and they took away all of the road markings, all of the road signs, more or less, and they made drivers more uncertain about what they should do. And because they were more uncertain, because there was less signs to rely on, less road markings to rely on, they were much more considerate of their fellow pedestrians on the road, and they would stop to let them cross the road even though there was no crossings marked on the road, that sort of thing. it makes me think of that. Essentially, you're sort of interrupting what someone expects, and that means that they maybe pay more attention.
I read a story about this recently where I think the book that I was reading was The 48 Laws of Power by Robert
Oh,
Greene, which is a
yeah.
really excellent book. Not always to be, the advice is not always to be applied in one's life
No.
if you want to, it's not for everyone. But the story goes like the master gardener has an apprentice and he's teaching the apprentice to trim the trees, and the apprentice starts climbing a very high tree and the master just watches him. He doesn't say anything, he gives no advice, no pointers, no comments. The apprentice goes up, very dangerous, very high up, trims the tree, does the thing, does the work, and he's coming down, and he's like maybe 1 meter above the surface. He's just going to jump down, and the master says, be careful. And someone who's there observing this situation asks the master, the guy just climbed up maybe like 10 meters, he could have fallen there and you said nothing, and he comes down and he's close to the ground, and there you kind of make a comment, why is that? And the master says that it's when we are close to safety that we make the most dangerous mistakes, but when we are in danger we actually pay attention.
Yeah.
So we have these kind of like, in design, almost everything in design, if you're making informed design decisions, what are they informed by? They are either informed by culture or by nature, which is like biology and neuroscience and this and that. So I think these things that we can apply to a lot of different areas, the way that the human organism and the brain works is you can find a lot of principles there and apply them to graphic design, and I guess this is one of them in a way.
There's two more things that jump out to me that I want to ask about, and then I think I'll wrap it up because it's it's a nice half hour then. The first one is I noticed that you've outlined these modules essentially with this grid, and then for the sections that could fit within a module, you've actually left space here. For example, you've left space above the module and below it, or above the content and below it. The same here, above rectangle and below the container. I'm curious about that choice because the natural temptation is to fill the module.
I just thought it looks nice, so I don't really have a scientific explanation for that. I did try. So the first version of this website was everything just, lines are kind of hitting the actual, like the line below the box was actually just hitting the box. However, if you look at the design, there's like this card kind of thing with the services, list of services as get started, like the yellow card that you pointed out, and then on the other side there's the button that says book a consultation. So if you don't leave any space, what happens is that those grid lines will very precisely intercept those buttons and cards and those things. But when it comes to the top, when it comes to the text, they do not intercept the top of the text very precisely. So there will be a tiny amount of space left between the text and the top line, whereas on the bottom, the interception is very just precise. Just there's no space between the card and the grid line, right? So there has to be some space, I think. You have to add some space between the grid line and the card or the button on this page. And when you start adding space, I just sort of experimented with different spacings and found this, which is, I think, I don't know, maybe it's twice the line height or something like that. So this was just the pleasing amount of space that I found. Otherwise, when you have text on one side, like text on the web just behaves very badly. It's just like very hard to keep aligning text properly. There's a property called align baseline or something like that, or items aligned. I forget the exact code name for it, but even that doesn't work as expected a lot of times. So you need to do like these little hacks and tricks to deal with text and other things sitting in a pleasing way on the web. By the way, I don't know if you're going to get to it, but one of the things that I spent some time on this webpage is actually the animations, and we haven't shown people the loading animation.
I was thinking about it. I'm going to refresh the page now just so people can see it.
So the grid lines kind of come in smoothly. On my screen, actually, because like it's a it's online transmission, so the animation is not. I don't see it smoothly on your like when I look at the screen share, but I guess you see it how it behaves because there's like
Yeah,
fine
for anyone
timing
watching
details
this,
in it.
for the record, it's smooth.
Yeah. So I had a lot of fun with the timing. I played around with different easings and so on. Again, the idea is just like super minimal, absolutely the most minimal design possible, but at the same time include as much design sophistication in that as possible. So there's a lot of like micro interactions, easings, animations, things like that, to incorporate that into the thing.
Yeah, it really represents itself well. It's a good demonstration of, keep it simple so that you can focus on those smaller details.
Yeah.
One thing I want to call out, I don't think we should discuss it too much, but one thing I really want to call out because it felt so natural to me, but I realize actually it is more sophisticated and less natural, if that makes sense, is that the first, let's call it the first, but the lowest sort of dark gray button here in this list is not aligned with the bottom of the container to its left. It's aligned with the button to its left.
Yeah.
Even though they're not necessarily that related as concepts, I think the natural tendency would be to align everything in these modules with everything in this module, which in this case is this yellow container. So I find that fascinating, and it makes perfect sense to me, which is why it almost didn't jump out to me, the fact that these two elements are aligned when they might not naturally be if you were just doing it by the book,
Yeah, if you align it with the bottom of the container, then it's very obviously misaligned with the button, unless you make the lower part, the lower space where it says like 1 of 3 slots available. If you don't make that equal to the height of the button, then it's going to be very misaligned. And I just didn't want to make that into like, there's no reason why I should enlarge that. So instead, I just moved everything up.
Yeah, it's interesting that something so visually heavy as this Get Started button, because it's visually heavy, it almost has this visual gravity where it pulls things around it into alignment with it naturally as you're designing it, because you think that feels better.
Yeah.
And so I guess this is us, or I don't know if you've come across this concept before, but this is me discovering this concept of not just visual weight, but visual gravity.
Oh, yeah.
Things want to be pulled towards this element because it's so dark. And so they don't naturally or conveniently align to the bottom of this yellow container. They naturally or conveniently align to the button instead.
That's an interesting idea. I like that concept.
Yeah, we're inventing new stuff as we speak. That's good. So the last thing I wanted to call out was this book a consultation button, because it's the same style as other buttons on the website, but it is not the same height. And I was curious about the reasoning behind that, given that these buttons are earlier on the page and they set up an expectation.
It just doesn't have enough content in it. I mean, the Get Started button also doesn't have enough content, but it kind of sits together with those other things which do have content, and that kind of necessitates height. So it kind of makes sense to have it the same height, and also it's like the call to action. That's how I get paid basically, when people press that button and go and buy the thing. So it just makes sense to have that be big. The other one is not. It's actually the same. So if you hover over the Twitter, Instagram, email things, especially the email thing I'm proud of, if you click that, it actually moves the email little letter thing. Like those micro interactions I've just kind of spent some time on. But those are the same height. So there's basically 2 kind of button sizes on this website. There's a small button, there's a big button.
That makes sense. Yeah. This
and also it just like, if it's just too monotone, if you have all of them the same height, like something has to change between those buttons. And I've already changed the color between the black one and the gray one. So just to add some variety, to add some flavor to it. If you have everything the same, then it just looks uninteresting. Same with like, the spacing between the gray buttons. It looks a bit boring, in addition to all the Gestalt principles stuff that we were talking about. This just looks more interesting.
Yeah, variety is the spice of life. All right, then I'm going to wrap it up there.
All right.
There's some really fascinating details in here, and it was an absolutely fascinating conversation as a result. So I wanted to thank you again.
Yeah.
And
thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I guess that's everything.
Cool.
I'm gonna stop there. Stop
All right.
this recording. Stop this recording.